What happens when a genius director decides to adapt one of the most iconic stories ever written? The greatest movie in modern cinema history, a masterpiece people will talk about for decades, Christopher Nolan's ultimate magnum opus, a revolutionary breakthrough in filmmaking. Nope. What we'll probably get is a black Helen of Troy, an ancient Greek poet who sounds like a SoundCloud rapper, Zendaya as Athena, and honestly, at this point, maybe even a transgender Achilles. And that's just the warm-up. Add in the usual modern upgrades, no real orchestral music, rap ballads, replacing actual poetry, shiny plastic sci-fi costumes, and there's some grey, washed-out color grading every streaming show seems legally required to use now. Because apparently, ancient Greece look exactly like a Netflix dystopia filmed in a parking garage with a $250 million budget. This is exactly how Christopher Nolan introduced his version of the Odyssey to the world. The internet exploded the moment news about the director's new movie hit the headlines. Fresh trailers, interviews, casting announcement. The hype around the project spread everywhere, almost instantly. Just not the kind of hype Nolan fans were hoping for. So what exactly went wrong? Why are tabloids, bloggers, and movie fans comparing Nolan's new film not to his previous work or to his biggest cinematic events of recent years, but to The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and Cleopatra? Is the situation really that disastrous? Or is the main problem simply a making campaign that completely missed the target? How did history lovers, mythology fans, anti-woke audiences, and regular moviegoers somehow unite in one shared mission, wanted to boycott a new adaptation of one of the most legendary epic ever written? In today's video we're going to break down what actually happened and why this movie became controversial long before anyone even saw the final product. Today we are going to analyze the entire situation, the interviews, the trailers, the casting choices, and try to figure out whether Christopher Nolan has completely lost his mind, or if there is actually some deeper logic behind all of this. So grab yourself a strong cup of tea, because we're diving in. Don't forget please to subscribe and give me some thumbs up. This is Alexandra Reed. Welcome. And before we can understand what exactly happened and why the internet is acting like ancient Greece personally offended them, we first need to talk about what the Odyssey actually is and why it matters so much to European culture as a whole. Because who could seriously question the massive influence that the Iliad and the Odyssey have had on world literature? These stories are the foundation of Western solid storytelling itself. It would be pretty hard to find anyone willing to downplay the importance of the work created by the most famous ancient Greek bard of all time, Homer. Both works traditionally attributed to Homer have inspired admiration for centuries, not just from writers, but from philosophers as well. Plato once called Homer the educator of Greece. His legendary later influenced thinkers like Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Friedrich Nietzsche, along with historians, geographers, linguists, filmmakers, painters, manga artists, and novelists. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. Outside the religious text, it's difficult to find works that shaped world literature and an art as deeply as the Iliad and the Odyssey. The lasting relevance of the Odyssey is built of two major things. First, the character of Odysseus himself, the ultimate hero, the smartest man in the room, the chosen survivor who keeps going no matter what. And second, how surprisingly modern the story still feels. Even thousands of years later, the narrative structure, themes, and emotional conflicts still work almost perfectly for modern audiences, which is honestly a little embarrassing for some contemporary screenwriters. Odysseus is definitely human, but not exactly an ordinary man. He's a king, one of the central, if not the central, heroes of the Trojan War, After all, it was his intervention that finally brought the conflict to an end. He is a father, a husband, a brilliant storyteller, and his long journey home becomes a test of every single one of these identities. Honestly, the entire structure feels incredibly familiar to modern audiences. It's basically the blueprint for every classic shonen protagonist and every hero a journey story ever written, because those storytelling structures were heavily inspired by Homer's work in the first place. The Greeks needed 10 years to conquer Troy. Odysseus then needed another 10 years and 40 days just to make it back home, reclaim his kingdom, and prove that surviving the war was actually the easy part, and that parallel is absolutely international. The Odyssey works almost like a mirror image, and at the same time the complete opposite of the Iliad. Both poems are divided into 24 books. On one side, you have 10 years of war. On the other, 10 years of wandering. And right in the center of the both stories stands Odysseus himself, a character who, in many ways, is a direct opposite of Achilles, the legendary hero of the Iliad. Achilles became famous because of his rage. Odysseus survives because of strategy, patience, and manipulation. Achilles is practically demigod, caught between two worlds and doomed to suffer because of it. Odysseus, meanwhile, is a deeply human, and his greatest strengths come from fully understanding his own limitations. Achilles leaves home searching for glory, fully aware that the path will eventually kill himself. Odysseus wants the exact opposite. He dreams only of going home. At one point, he's even offered immortality and turns it down, which honestly feels like the least Hollywood decision any protagonist has ever made. In many years, the Odyssey is basically a metaphor for human life itself, a long series of trails where people constantly lose and rediscover who they are. And the monsters and challenges in the story aren't just random fantasy creatures either. Most of them carry symbolic meaning. Take the Cyclops, for example. His physical blindness reflects Odysseus' own metaphorical blindness. Drunk on victory and pride, Odysseus becomes reckless, ignores basic caution, and ends up provoking Poseidon himself, which, as you can imagine, turns out to be a truly terrible career decision. No matter where the hero ends up, his pride is constantly being tested. He has to confront not only his own weaknesses, but also the flaws of his companions, the same flaws deeply tied to human nature itself. More than anyone before him, Homer emphasized human vulnerability. Mortals in this stories are painfully weak compared to the forces threatening them. Whether those forces are storms, monsters, or gods, is the only thing that allow a person to survive are willpower, intelligence, and most importantly, the ability to remain balanced and disciplined instead of giving it to arrogance or impulse. But the Odyssey, like many works this ancient, has one major characteristic that often becomes the source of endless problems when people try to adapt or reinterpret it. There is no single universally accepted translation and therefore no single universally accepted interpretation. Every culture has built its own relationships with Homer's work, and that's exactly where the chaos begins. The English-speaking world really went all in all Homer. Over the years, readers have been given more than 10, maybe even 15 major translations of the Odyssey, each offering a completely different tone, style, and interpretation. And honestly, that sounds great in theory. Everyone gets to choose the version that speaks to them personally. But is that actually a good thing? And what does any of this have to do with Christopher Nolan? Well, once you understand how many interpretations of Homer's exist, you realize Nolan had a choice to make. Which version of the Odyssey would become the foundation for his adaptation? Which translation would share the entire tone of the film? And Nolan chose the 2017 translation by Emily Wilson. And according to many critics online, that is the real controversial surrounding Nolan's adaptation, far more than any individual casting choice. So why exactly has this become such a huge issue? The answer is that we first need to understand who Emily Wilson actually is, and why Nolan keeps brightening her up in the interviews. In several recent press appearances, Nolan specifically referenced Wilson's translation as a version that helped him connect more deeply with Homer's work. In an interview with Empire, he even said that Wilson's translation made him appreciate Odysseus' intelligence, cunning, and creativity in a completely new way. Sounds impressive, but who exactly is Emily Wilson? She's a translator, professor at the University of Pennsylvania, author, and a well-known third-wave feminist scholar. She's also an activist, a vocal advocate for women's rights, and a literary critic who has openly challenged traditional interpretations of Homer for years. In 2017, she published her own translation of the Odyssey, and that's where the internet culture war alarm bells immediately started going off. And this is the part where I originally wanted to calmly explain Wilson's approach. But honestly, I can't do it calmly anymore, so let's start from the safe distance. The Odyssey is an ancient Greek text. And as you probably understand, it wasn't written in modern conversational Greek. It was written in an extremely old poetic dialect, full of layered meanings, rhythm, symbolism, and phrases that scholars still argue about thousands of years later. In other words, translating Homer is a nightmare. Nobody agrees on the correct version because half the time translators are basically standing over a linguistic fossil trying to guess whether Homer meant wise traveler, cunning survivor, or guy having the worst vacation in human history. So let's look at one simple but very revealing example. One of the classic descriptions of Odysseus is often translated as a man of many experiences, someone who has lived through countless trails and gained wisdom from them. Now here's the thing get interesting. English translation handled this phrase very differently, and eventually we'll get to the version Nolan chose. But first, let's take an older translation by Samuel Butler. For example, his version is extremely straightforward. He basically describes Odysseus as a man of many ways. Simple, clean, flexible. You can interpret it however you want. Maybe it refers to the countless twists and turns of his journey. Maybe it's about the many choices, good and bad, he had to make. Maybe it's about a temptation, survival, mistakes, victories, betrayals, or reintervention. The phrase leaves space for interpretation, which is usually what Greek literature does. Then, about 30 years later, Robert Fegles comes along and writes, "Sing to me of the man, muse the man of twists and turns." Notice the difference. Already not tell me, but sing to me. Small detail, but it changes the mood completely. Even the very first line starts feeling more dramatic, more poetic, more cinematic. And twists and turns is honestly a pretty cool interpretation. It gives Odysseus the feeling of constant movement, chaos, unpredictability, like the man spent 10 years trapped inside the world's longest plot twist. Then, in 2000, Stanley Lambretta offers another version where the narrator addresses memory instead of the traditional muse. Interesting choice, more personal, more introspective. Odysseus becomes less of a mythological superhero and more of the wandering survivor haunted by his past. And then there's my personal favorite, Robert Fitzgerald, who describes Odysseus as a man skilled in all ways of contending. Beautiful translation, elegant, complex, it captures intelligence, adaptability, and struggle all at once. And that's the point. There are countless interpretations of these opening lines. 12, 15, maybe even more major variations depending on the translator. Now imagine you're Christopher Nolan. You're about to adapt one of the most important stories in Western literature. The opening lines of your movie will define the entire tone of the project. This is literally the audience's first impression of your Odyssey. And out of all possible versions, Nolan chooses Emily Wilson, a third-wave feminist scholar whose translation was published in 2017. And the funny thing is, you don't even need to read the entire translation to immediately understand what her interpretation of the Odyssey is trying to do. Now let's look at Wilson's actual opening line. This is that Nolan chose as a foundation for his adaptation. Wilson writes, "Tell me about a complicated man." That's it. A complicated man. Not a man of many paths. Not a man shaped by suffering and experience. Not a hero of endless twists and trials. Just a complicated guy. And honestly, that's an insane simplification of the original text. The poetry is basically gone, completely flattened, because the phrase immediately changed the entire framing of the character. Tell me about a complicated man. You can already feel the modern philosophical language creeping in. Suddenly, Odysseus sounds less like an epic hero and more like a somebody your friend warns you about before a toxic relationship. And according to many critics of Wilson's translation, that's not accidental. The argument isn't simply that her personal worldview influenced the translation. Every translation inevitably brings some bias into the work. That's normal. The criticism is that Wilson's version often feels less like a translation of the Odyssey into modern English and more like an intentional reinterpretation of Homer through the lens of modern third-wave feminist critical theory. In other words, critics argue that the goal was not just to translate the text, but to reshape its meaning in order to better align with contemporary ideological framework. As for many readers, the word complicated in the very first line becomes symbolic of entire approach. From that point onwards, they argue the translation starts feeling less like Homeric epic poetry and more like a modern academic deconstruction of masculinity, power, gender, and heroism. According to many English-speaking critics, Wilson's version systematically changes not only the literal meaning of certain passages, but also the tone, rhythm, narrative style, and overall spirit of Homer's work itself. As a result, the Odyssey in Wilson's interpretation can sometimes start to feel less like an epic poem and more like an extremely long DIY theory workshop where Odysseus is framed as a morally questionable to a degree the original text itself does not fully support. At least not if you read Homer directly and as a whole. Not obviously. People are free to view Wilson's work differently. Some see it as an important and necessary feminist reinterpretation of a classic text. Others see it as a forced, ideological, and deeply revisionist. But personally, my concern is much simpler. There is a very real chance that Nolan's 3-hour blockbuster will once again spend most of its runtime recycling modern ideological thinking points. Only this time dressed up in Bronze Age, atheistic, intentionally ugly, anachronic armor, grey streaming service cinematography, and sets that somehow make ancient Greece look like an abandoned sci-fi warehouse. At times, it generally feels like the project's goal is not simply to interpret the myth, but to dismantle the heroic archetype itself. The cultural image of the brave, intelligent, determined man that Homer helped build into the foundation of Western storytelling. And the biggest issue isn't even the translation itself. The biggest issue is that Christopher Nolan, through the sheer scale and influence of the film, is about to popularize the specific interpretation of Homer in mainstream culture. And let's be honest here, the average American high school student has probably never actually read the Iliad or the Odyssey. Maybe a summary, maybe a TikTok slideshow with dramatic musical in the background. That's about it. So, for millions of viewers, Nolan's version may effectively become the official Odyssey in public consciousness, whether it accurately reflects Homer's original spirit or not. And that naturally leads to the biggest question of all. Who exactly is this movie even being made for? In a strangely impressive achievement, Christopher Nolan somehow assembled a cast representing every ethnicity, nationality, and demographic imaginable except apparently actual Greeks. What makes this even more confusing is Nolan's own recent comments about authenticity. In interviews, he emphasized his desire to preserve the true sound of ancient Greece and even explained his decision to avoid orchestral music because, quote, orchestras did not exist at that time. And honestly, the choice could have sounded truthful and artificially justified. If the rest of the movie followed the same logic of historical consistency, but it clearly doesn't. Which leaves us with two possibilities. Either Nolan is being deeply selective about what counts as authentic, or the genuinely sees no contradiction in this kind of pick and choose realism. Because in some areas his Odyssey suddenly becomes extremely grounded and symbolic. Nolan has already hinted that the gods themselves will likely be reduced to metaphors, representations of nature, psychology, and human consciousness rather than literal divine beings. But in other areas, the movie seems to drift as far away from realism as humanly possible, especially when it comes to costume design, armor, and the overall visual aesthetic. So what audiences end up seeing in the trailers and promotional material isn't really ancient Greece. It feels more like a collage of modern assumptions about ancient Greece. A fast food version of Homer redesigned for a contemporary progressive audience with the attention span of a streaming platform autoplay screen. And honestly, considering the cultural climate, the backlash was almost inevitable. Audiences are exhausted. Years of failed reboots, modernized adaptations, and franchise reinterpretations overloaded with social commentary have made viewers deeply suspicious. The second, they sense another ideological rewrite approaching. And that's why for many people the issue is not simply the casting itself. On its own, the choice of a black actress to play Helen of Troy would probably not create this level of outrage. The casting becomes controversial because audiences interpret it as a signal, a warning sign that much larger ideological changes to the story are coming behind it. A symbol that one of the foundational myths of Western culture is once again about to be dismantled, rewritten, and filtered through modern political frameworks instead of being treated as the mythological epic it originally was. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe and give me thumbs up and high points. Also, I wait you in the comment section. See you in my next video about Euphoria. Bye bye.